Good morning, everybody, and happy Father's Day to those to whom that applies, myself included. I can show off, I've got the latest collection. This is an oldie but goodie. My dad came through last week, and he had some ties that we had given him that he no longer wears, and this was oh, we're going to zoom in, are we? This is a collection that I didn't have yet. These guys are, I don't know, 12, 8, and whatever, so years ago. Anyhow, I'm a proud dad, happy to wear the title, literally. Let me open us in prayer and we'll get started. Lord God, thank you for being our Father. Whether we had good ones or not on earth, we have a fabulous one in heaven. And we thank you for being that for us. We thank you for speaking truth into our lives, for using your timeless word to continue to speak that truth. I pray as we've read this week and as we continue in this habitual one chapter a day read, that we can hear you speak to us that frequently, that we can be instructed by your fatherly wisdom that frequently, that we can be more like your son Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. If you are on schedule with your readings, you should have finished the book of Esther for today. We will cover and discuss chapters 5 through 10. 6 through 10 was what we were supposed to be discussing today. This coming week, we are going to jump way to the back end of the Old Testament. We're going to tackle the book of Daniel. Recall, I kind of had to upheave our schedule a little bit, so there's not quite the continuity. But Daniel's kind of a standalone book. It doesn't really need a ramp up from a predecessor book, so I felt like we could tackle Daniel. So the first 6 chapters of Daniel are your reading assignments for this week. We will have one more class session next Sunday. That will be the last session for this class, because the following Sunday will be the first in July, in which we will be transitioning to having the elder-led classes. Yeah, Dan, if you could help with that. I will hope and encourage you to continue reading, at least finish the book of Daniel, which will be there's 2 weeks of Daniel reading, one this coming and one after that, even though we're not going to gather together and chat about that last half of Daniel. I'd like you to finish the task, cross the finish line, okay? So with that, today again, we are to talk about the book of Esther. We're going to resume our character studies and look at a few folks we haven't yet looked at. Before I get into that, does anybody have any observation, question, comment you would prefer to launch now in our open mic session? My version does not talk about impaling.
It just talks about being impaled.
What version is that, Rhonda?
It's the Life Application Study Bible, but it's the NIV version.
Yeah, I have impaled also.
Okay, so we got a couple of folks whose translations talk about Haman being impaled. The rest of us are surprised to hear that, because our translations talk about him being hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai.
For Mordecai, and I'd always heard that, but this was not. This was specifically throughout the chapter talks about a pole, and that they impaled him.
I don't know how to answer that question. That's an interesting observation. I've only read impaled, including what I have in front of me today. So, sorry, I only read hanged, so I didn't know anything about.
Well, either way, it was.
Clearly, yeah, but we're gonna get to. We're going to get to that, certainly. Yeah, it's a unfortunate demise for a guy that maybe earned it. But other thoughts, questions, comments besides the stumper that Rhonda raised? Why are there such a different translation for the death event? All right. Thank you, Mark, for being at the ready. I do want to have some readers, so if you would step. We're going to now last week we talked about King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as some of your translations say, and Haman. We're going to visit those folks, but our character study focused on those 2 gentlemen. We're going to now look at the other 2 main players in the story. The first is Mordecai, quote, the Jew. Like almost any time you see Mordecai referenced, it's Mordecai the Jew. He kind of has this label attached to him, and I think that's going to be important. But I want to have a couple of us do some reading. We're going to be reading out of Esther 2. I know we're jumping back a bit. The whole character study format is going to make us traverse into prior week's readings, but hopefully you'll be okay with that. Can I get one reader to start us off, reading chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, and then jump to verse 15. This is just a little bit of backstory on Mordecai. Show Mark by hand who you are so he can be there with the microphone. All right, Dan Parks, thank you. Ken, Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Just do that first, and I'll jump you to the next one.
Okay. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shemel, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because he had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died.
All right, can you jump to verse 15? It kind of repeats some of that, but let's hear that one from you as well.
Okay. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested.
You can actually stop right there. It was really more about, the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. So, again, they are related, but it's not father-daughter. It is cousin, which means that Mordecai's uncle's daughter is Esther. There appears that we can't confirm this with absolute certainty, but it appears there's an age disparity to where it's not brother-sister. I mean, they're kind of equating this as father-daughter, even though they have more of a level relationship from a genealogical standpoint, but it surmises that he's older than her and he's kind of guiding her as a father would rather than as a sibling of sorts. So he adopts her. It also mentions in what Dan read that these folks were part of the ones that were deported when Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered Judah. Next week, as we read the book of Daniel, and the week thereafter, it focuses on that same scenario. And we're going to actually read about Nebuchadnezzar. So just a quick backstory. Judah is the southern half of what became a split nation of Israel. The northern half rebelled against God more fervently, more early, and didn't repent, and so God judged them and caused them to fall in the hands of, I forget who, some captors, and bad things happened to what was called Israel. That Judah survived, walked a little better along the lines of God's path, but they also strayed to the point that God said, enough, and I'm going to use Babylon to be my instrument of discipline, and King Nebuchadnezzar came, conquered Judah, deported the people that he felt might be useful to his kingdom. Daniel and the folks in that book or among that, and as Dan read, I don't know that Mordecai and Esther were alive at that moment because this is not King Nebuchadnezzar's time, but at least his kin were grabbed and brought to Jerusalem, or brought to the Babylonian Empire, and particularly in Susa is where we find Mordecai. So anyhow, so that's Mordecai. He's Jewish. He's from Benjamin. He is essentially the quasi-father of Esther. Can I get somebody else to read the same chapter? We're going to stay in chapter 2. Sorry, Mark. Verses 10 and 11, a little more on, again, we're still focusing, this is a character study right now on Mordecai. 10 and 11, show me by hand, or show Mark by hand so we can get the mic to you. Great, Barbara, thank you. So chapter 2, 10 and 11, please.
Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her.
All right, thank you, Barbara. So why did Mordecai give Esther this instruction to be quiet about her ethnicity?
They were basically the enemy at some point.
We learned, yes, Ronna, and we learned that Haman had a strong anti-Semitism, and we talked about that last week. And so it appears, from that verse, that Mordecai is at least aware of the fact that her ethnicity probably won't do her any favors and might put her in peril, and so he says as much. Because perhaps it's more of an enemy perception, or it's just a flat prejudice. We don't like these Jews, which was more Haman's view than the Jews are a threat to us, which was perhaps along the lines of what Rhonda suggests. Either way, that narrative suggests that Mordecai is looking out for Esther, as a father would. both in checking in on her as he walks by, where she's staying, how's she doing, and giving her instruction. Last section about Mordecai, verses 21 through 23, the same chapter. Can I get another reader for that segment? Thank you, Mark, for being mobile. Chris, you raising your thumb? All right, we're going to let Chris do it. Again, chapter 2, verses 21 through 23.
In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
Very good. All right, so we also see in Mordecai not just a desire to look after Esther in all facets, and a willingness to take on that responsibility, which was a heavy responsibility, and to do it well, but he is even aware of and desires to protect a threat to this king, who was not a Jew. And is not, this is a conquering nation. He's basically in exile, and he's been a captive. Yet he sees this harm about to unfold, and he feels it's his duty to report it. He has, an inside track, so to speak, in Esther, who is at this point queen. He tells her, she tells the people, they look into it. Sure enough, this is a legitimate threat. This was an assassination attempt. Off these guys go to the gallows. Did yours say impaled, Rhonda? It did, okay. All right, so apparently there's some dispute whether all these deaths are by impalement or by hanging. Barbara.
I had a note, mine says hanged on the gallows, but there's a note that says, or wooden beam or stake, Hebrew tree or wood. This Persian execution practice involved affixing or impaling a person on a stake or a pole. Compare Ezra 6:11.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So he was they were executed. We'll put it that way. By whatever cruel method, it's not, a friendly end. All right, so this is Mordecai. So now let's fast forward. Last week when we talked about Haman and we talked about his anti-Semitism, it was fueled by a particular behavior of Mordecai. Do you recall the behavior that Mordecai exhibited that caused Haman such rage?
He refused to honor or bow down to Haman after he'd been honored by the king.
Exactly. And I'm going to go ahead and do the reading just for time's sake. That's out of chapter 3, so you should be at the end of chapter 2, so just drop your eyes down a little or to the right if you're needed to reverse a page. I'll be reading chapter 3, beginning verse 2. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman because the king had commanded this be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" When they had warned him day after day and he still would not listen to them, they told Haman to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them that he was a Jew. All right. So yes, that was the behavior Rhonda correctly recalled. Haman was the lone guy that was standing up. Mordecai was the lone guy that was standing up. Haman's parading around. He had just been elevated to second in charge, second big cheese. And as he's parading around the city, everybody's dropping and paying him the respect, because frankly the king's ordered that, except Mordecai. So Mordecai's standing like this. Everybody else is on their face. These cohorts are asking him, "What are you doing?" And day after day, and yet he continues to stand as Haman passes. Everybody else is paying him a royalty-type honor. Why did Haman refuse to do like everybody else and bow down to Haman as he's walking around in his big stuff attitude? Not a trick question.
Because he was a Jew. He only worshiped the one and only true God.
Good. So we don't see, there's not an actual explanation for his behavior, but the passage, I think, clearly implies that's the explanation, is that he will pay respect to his authorities, but he's not going to pay worshipful respect to them. He's not going to bow down, even if it's just in body language and not in spirit. He just doesn't even want to do anything that would appear as though he's providing some sort of worshipful homage to whomever, any person of sorts. What were the consequences, let me ask, what were the potential consequences to Mordecai for this choice? And I mean, they're pleading with him, why are you disobeying the king? And he continued to do that. Just let's kind of extrapolate. What were some things that could flow from this behavior that Mordecai has presumably voluntarily decided to do? I'm not going to bow down to Haman. He could be killed. All right. Absolutely. And perhaps some lesser stuff, but certainly killing, whether it's this thing that Barbara read, it's impalement or attached to a tree or hanged. Death is certainly, I think, a potential risk he has to be aware of. I mean, Haman seems sharp enough at this point. He's not dumb. I mean, he wouldn't think I can do this with impunity. What else? What are some other potential consequences? And I'm really asking because the story takes a surprising turn in relation to this behavior. What's the consequence that flows from Mordecai not bowing down?
Exalt his people.
There we go. So in this instance, Mordecai is again, I think we can fairly read in the narrative, he wants to honor his Lord and Savior, the Jewish God. And to him that meant I'm not going to fall on my knees in sort of a bowing position to any person. And I'm aware of my personal safety risk in doing such. And nonetheless, this is what I feel is the right thing to do. Haman, as we looked at last week, took that offense strongly and decided, I'm not only going to get rid of Mordecai, quote, the Jew, but let's wipe out all of these filthy people. I don't know that Mordecai perceived that risk. Maybe he did. I want to ask the question because that's how the story unfolds. Chapter 3 is not about how am I going to kill Mordecai. It's about how am I going to wipe out the entirety of the Jewish people that are within the confines of this kingdom. And let me ask the king and tell all the stuff we talked about last week, how Haman is just so filled with a distorted view of the Jews that he paints this horrible and inaccurate account, broad-brushing every Jewish person as being defiant of the king and not worthy of life even. Give me the ability and I'll just exterminate these people. So Mordecai's behavior here now creates some zone of risk to others. And we're going to circle back to that. That's, I think, a fairly important thing. All right, so continuing with the narrative, we're going to skip forward and recall what happened last week. Haman does present this case to the king, and the king seems nonchalant and not aware of this behavior and doesn't seem to want to get proof or even ask, okay, Haman, here's my ring, do whatever you want. So we're going to skip down to verse 13. I'm going to have Mark sit for just a little bit. I'll have him up and about in a moment. But Esther chapter 3, verse 13, now this proclamation is entered, the royal signet ring that Xerxes or Ahasuerus gave to Haman was now affixed on this edict, which communicated to those who read it this came from the king. This was approved by the king. And Mordecai reads this letter, and I'm going to read what he does in response. Chapter 3, verse 13. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces, telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plundered their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. So that's the edict, and then jump to verse 1 of chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went into the middle of the city, and cried loudly and bitterly. Until really just preparing this lesson, I read that narrative countless times and perceived that behavior, that reaction by Mordecai was grief about what was now going to be declared against his people. And as I thought through the prior question I posed to you, and I thought about did that play a role in this, part of me thinks that now Mordecai is definitely feeling that, but he's also probably feeling a little bit of responsibility for this. Had I just bowed down, I could have crossed my fingers and not really meant it like we used to do as a kids, say promise or whatever, and bow down, and Haman doesn't know any better, and my people are spared, and here I go doing what I think is right, and now God has somehow allowed this to happen? Oh my goodness. So, I don't know that for certain, but I wonder if the angst that this verse 1 of chapter 4 portrays is in part some sense of guilt or responsibility for being the impetus, the cause, the instigator to Haman, who then decides, I'm not just going to wipe out Mordecai, and I was willing to die for the cause, but oh my gosh, now 1 million of my kin are going to die for that same cause, and they didn't get the chance to speak to this issue. All right, so he advises Queen Esther. So now we're going to shift and look at Queen Esther. We heard a little bit about her, but we're going to go back and revisit those. Mark, I would like you to pick up the mic and roam again if you would. We're going to go back to chapter 2. Can I get a different reader? There's going to be just a little bit of overlap for some of it, but can somebody, maybe one reader, read a 3-verse segment for me? Show me by hand, show Mark by hand. A different reader if possible. Some brave soul, raise their hand. All right, Tiffany, you were the brave soul. Chapter 2, Tiffany, if you could read verses 15 through 17, and then I'll have you jump to one other verse.
When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any other woman, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti.
Can you jump to verse 20 and read that one too, please?
But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up.
All right, thank you. So this is, again, a quick synopsis. Esther becomes queen. And recall I described last week this scenario that seemed essentially a beauty pageant. Let's get all the virgins and parade the prettiest ones in front of the king, and he gets to pick which one he wants, and she's going to take the place of Vashti because that darn Vashti just defied me publicly, and I can't stand that. So she's gone, and we're going to get somebody else in here. And so Esther becomes that person. And even though it was, seemingly a superficial type of pageant of sorts, my translation pretty well echoed what Tiffany read, but the middle part of 17 said, she won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. So my question was, what is it you think that caused her to earn more favor than any of the others who were paraded in front of King Xerxes?
But there was also mentioned before that Esther had requested nothing but what the king's eunuch, whose name Hegai, the custodian of the women, she would follow his advice.
Good.
So I don't know, maybe he had like insights.
Maybe. Esther, you do this and you're going to get in. Just trust me. Yeah. Good. Well, those are both good insights, Chris. We see in this, and one of the talking points I wanted to make is we see in Esther an obedience. She trusts this particular eunuch who was in charge. I skipped over the middle of chapter 2, where this guy's basically in charge of all the ladies that are assembled, and there's like a 6-month beauty regimen to kind of prepare for this moment. So she's certainly compliant to his leadership and obeying him. And then the last part that I had Tiffany read, she still continued to obey what Mordecai had given her as instructions. So we see a lady that seems compliant and respectful of the instruction of others and, in fact, following them. Jim, you had your hand up.
Yeah, it said earlier in 12 that they came and completed a 12-month course.
12 months, okay.
She finished in 10 months. So it's like she didn't even need the extra months.
Yeah, so maybe, there was less to work with on her. I think all of this is good. Where I was going with that, and I'm not to disagree with any of what you said, is this, again, this appears on its face to be a beauty contest. And while certainly we're told she's beautiful, I have to believe, and it's probably because of the Lord's favor and maybe because she's complying, I think that she somehow exuded a beauty beyond her physical characteristics. Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened. I don't know if there was an interview, if there was a talent show, the things that we kind of associate with the current version of a beauty contest. But I got to believe it's more than just parading up and down, wearing your best dress, and then the next one comes and does the same. I think there's some opportunity where she is able to not just present her physical attributes, but just somehow demonstrate more of her. In essence, maybe it's a Lord-inspired essence. It's a complying with, having a submissive spirit, which Vashti, clearly didn't have, at least not in the eyes of Xerxes. Maybe that accelerated her treatment course because she just was able to kind of get that stuff, not just how to put stuff on my face, but how to exude beauty beyond physical attribute. Where I'm going with that is I think Esther was a beauty in every aspect.
Plus, she won Miss Congeniality.
There you go. Had she not taken the queen's, she would have at least had that, badge to wear as she goes back to Mordecai's house. But she didn't go back to Mordecai's house. She became the queen. So she got selected, and again, I think it's more than just her physical appearance. So then we're back to where Mordecai now learns of this. He's wearing sackcloth and these ashes in the middle of the street screaming. He sends word to Esther, and he tells her what has happened. Do you recall Esther's response when she learns of what Mordecai has to share? It's in chapter 4. We're going to be going there, but generally, you recall.
She sent him some clothes to wear.
Well, yeah. All right. So first, she finds out, hey, Mordecai's like looking like a pauper in the middle of the street, and she's like, what the heck's that about? Let's get him close. And then, so yeah, you're right. I kind of skipped over that one. Ultimately, she learns why Mordecai's that way. There has been an edict that came from the palace that says all the Jews are going to get killed in 4 Thursdays, or whatever the day was. What was her initial response to that? Do you recall, generally?
It says great distress.
She was greatly distressed. Mordecai wanted her to do something. I mean, the message wasn't just, hey, be aware you're going to be the last one, but do something. You're the queen. And her initial response was concern, certainly for this edict, but also concern for self. Let me read. Esther chapter 4, verse 10 and 11. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned, the death penalty. Only if the king extends the golden scepter will that person live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. So Mordecai says, this terrible thing has happened. This is why I look like a wreck. You go do something about it. You're the queen. Can you talk to the king and talk him off this ledge? And she says this, don't you realize that if I show up at the king and he didn't want to see me, off goes my head? So she has her initial response is one of self-concern and self-preservation. Is that a surprising initial response?
I don't think so, but
Good. That's the answer I'm looking for. I don't think so either. Well, go ahead. Tell me the but.
I kind of see a difference here with her not even knowing about this edict being issued. That first off, she learns about Mordecai and his weeping and mourning. Tries to remedy that by sending clothes.
Yeah.
Not even really kind of paying attention
Right.
to why.
Fix yourself. You look like a wreck.
She finds out why.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, oh, okay. And then when she hears Mordecai say, you need to go fix this with the king. You're the queen. And she's like all quoting royal etiquette and administrative decorum. I think that kind of shows us that there was a serious disconnect between the daily running of life of the people,
Oh, clearly.
the administrative rulings of the court, and I kind of think Esther,
And the
I'm not
royalty.
trying to impugn her integrity, but I kind of think she and all in her realm was kind of kept separate.
I agree.
So, in her defense, she's kind of right by saying, well, wait a minute, what can I do? Because she's been so immersed in this etiquette.
And compliance with
Yes.
following rules.
Yes.
That's
yes.
I hadn't thought about the whole etiquette thing. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I think, I mean, she's unaware of this, so there's definitely some level of insulation. The higher-ups that live in the palace don't know what's going on out there. Don't need to know. This is news to her. Oh my gosh, the Jew, that's terrible. And then, you want me to do something about it? Well, first there's these rules, and I've been following the rules so far, and God seems to be blessing me for doing that. Plus, this one rule kind of says I could die if I just show up and, hey, king, I got to tell you something, and he didn't want me, you're gone. Another beauty pageant. So she's concerned that, this could be the end of me, and I don't know that I want to do that. At a more base human level, I think all that's correct, Chris, and a deeper than I was planning to plunge. Just at a more base human level, I think we all can appreciate a scenario that we perceive as threatening self, and the initial response is to preserve self. And despite her commendable attributes and being queen and all that, and maybe because of some of those other things, but I think just to bare essence, one is usually reluctant to risk self if they can avoid that risk. And so she's giving voice to the concern, I could die. And of course, Mordecai kind of corrects her perspective. Well, you can die then, or you can wait until this edict comes out, and you can die then. You're not going to escape death. And then he says the famous words that we ended last week's session. This was the cliffhanger for last week, and we're now circled back to it. I will resume the reading beginning in verse 12. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place." That's an interesting comment. He seems to kind of have some hope in the midst of his sitting in the middle of the city like a pauper. "But you and your father's house will be destroyed. Who knows, perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." That's where we ended last week. So Mordecai kind of corrects her. Self is not going to be preserved by being silent. You are a Jew. It will be, he's kind of essentially saying, it'll be discovered. You're going to suffer the same fate as everybody else. This is your moment. Perhaps God put you in this unexpected position to be the queen of this conquering nation for this moment. So thankfully, she opens her mind to that. She responds by telling him, okay, please assemble the Jews, pray and fast. I'm going to do likewise with my ladies. I'm going to approach the king, and we'll see what happens, essentially. So she does approach the king, and thankfully he extends the gold scepter, and she can come in. But we're going to pause there. Chapter 6, and I got to pick up the pace. Chapter 6 is the chapter of irony in this story. And even though some translations talk about impalement versus hanging, we're going to go with the hanging version of the narrative. Chapter 6 begins immediately following the last verse of 5, where the wife tells Haman, "Stop bellyaching about Mordecai. Remember, you had that great day, and now you're all fussing because Mordecai still stood as you rode by. Build a gallows, finish the guy, move on with your life," essentially. She said, "That's a great idea." So he makes this gigantic gallows, 75 feet tall, for the sole purpose of hanging Mordecai. The next morning, like his crew has just finished, and he got a good night's sleep, and he shows up the next morning early, shows up at the king's palace in chapter 6, with the stated purpose of getting permission to seize Mordecai and hang him. Unbeknownst to Haman, in the beginning of chapter 6, we see King Xerxes having a fitful night's sleep. And it's funny, I think it's kind of funny. The cure for his fitful night's sleep, can you read the historical accounts? He's like, I need to go to sleep. Somebody put me to sleep. How about reading the historical accounts? That should put me to sleep. But it didn't. And as the person read the historical accounts, they read about Mordecai's reporting this assassination plot, and the king's still awake, and he says, well, what's been done for that guy? That was a pretty good thing. What's been done? Nothing's been done to that guy. Well, let me figure that out. And he calls, who's nearby that can help me figure this out? And Haman happened to be there, again, with the goal of, I want to take Mordecai and hang him. And the king brings him in. I'm just going to read the narrative because we don't have time. The king brings in Haman, doesn't tell Haman whom he's talking about, but says, Haman, what would I, as king, do to pay appropriate honor to someone that I want to honor? And Haman, again, all full of himself, thinks, he's talking about me. What can we do? You can put that person on the king's horse, and you can put that person in the king's robe and kind of dress him up fancy and have some lowly person parade around in front of the horse, in front of the big stuff behind, and everybody's going to be celebrating what wonderful person you are, blah, blah, blah. King Xerxes says, that's a fabulous idea. I want you to be the one doing that part, and Mordecai's going to be the one doing the sitting on the horse part. What? Can you imagine how Haman would have felt at that point as he discovers that the person the king wants to honor is not himself, but Mordecai, the very guy that he was hoping to hang in 20 minutes? And the king has very different plans. So Mordecai becomes the one honored, rightfully so. Haman is the one parading around in front of the horse. Now the guy that used to be the big stuff is now walking in front of Mordecai, quote, the Jew, and showing him honor. And in the end, as we know, at the end of chapter 6, Haman's wife, I think Chris brought it up last week, Haman's wife saw the writing on the wall and essentially said, your downfall is certain, essentially. Chapter 7, Esther does have the courage. She does invite the king and Haman to one banquet, but seemingly doesn't have the courage to drop the bomb then. So she says, come back tomorrow night. I'm going to do it again. And tomorrow night is how chapter 6, about midway through chapter 6, sorry, no, the beginning of chapter 7 is when the tomorrow night shows up. She brings in both Haman and the king, and the king says again, thank you for this lovely event. What can I do for you? Up to half the kingdom, blah, blah. And here's where she becomes greatly transparent. The courageous lady that we know her to be and give her credit to be, she says, King, I'm a Jew. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but per the king's signet, there has been an edict issued that says all of my people, including the one talking to you, is going to be exterminated 4 Thursdays from now, or, whatever the day was. And King has no idea about this. His response to this news is shock, because he just frankly doesn't know. Because again, as we talked last week, the king seems to be delegating too much and not paying attention to his kingdom. So he knows nothing of this. He's really perturbed. There's some interesting details within chapter 7, but long and short of it is she discloses Haman is the architect of this edict, and the king decides that Haman needs to die for such a thing, and let's go ahead and use the gallows that Haman erected for his own death. So Haman is killed on their own gallows. Again, I'm going to go the hanging on the gallows translation because that's what I'm familiar with. I don't know where impalement fits in that. But basically the execution platform that was intended for Mordecai is now the one that Haman himself falls victim to. Skipping to, now we're going to look briefly at King Xerxes, and then we're going to wrap this thing up. So King Xerxes, again, is offended by this plan. And I think more than just because Queen Esther would be one of the ones suffering. I think once he learns really what this is all about, more so than what Haman said, I think his eyes open to the fact this is not justice. This is not who I am as the king or appropriate. But he's left with a little bit of a conundrum because this nation, kind of like as you'll see in the book of Daniel, some of these nations have basically a rule. Once a law is declared, it can't be undone. So you can't call it the legislation for the next year and just undo it like the rest of us can in modern society. He's got to deal with that law. So he essentially allows Mordecai the chance to undo it. Before we get there, let me just say one thing because I think it's important. I'm going to read just an isolated verse out of chapter 6. The king told Haman, this is back when he wants to elevate this person. The king told Haman, hurry and do just as you proposed. Take a garment and a horse for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not leave out anything you have suggested. So we see in this, I see in that comment, he's identifying Mordecai's ethnicity and doesn't bother by that at all. In fact, I want this guy to be elevated, even though he is a Jew. So I think one attribute that maybe favors Xerxes is he doesn't seem to be anti-Semitic. Maybe he's anti-things, but not Jewish people, because he's fine with Mordecai being a Jew and still earning this parading around on the king's horse with the king's royal robe over him. So fast forward to chapter 8. He now elevates Mordecai, the one who saved his life through this thwarting of this assassination plot, to become basically the next Haman, to be that level of command. And he gives Mordecai the opportunity to figure out a way to fix this mess that King Xerxes allowed to happen under the leadership of Haman, this edict to exterminate the Jewish people. Chapter 8, I will read, again for time's sake, verses 7 to 8. King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, again in my translation it's like Mordecai the Jew. Look, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows because he attacked the Jews. You may write in the king's name whatever pleases you concerning the Jews and seal it with royal signet ring. A document written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet ring cannot be revoked. That's why they had to do this new law, because the last one was written in the king's name and sealed with a signet ring. So I can't just tear it up and say, never mind that. That law still's there, and it says 4 Thursdays from now all the Jews are going to be killed. So now the task is how do we fix that? We got to fix it with a new law that's going to coexist with that law. Mordecai figured out, here's my ring. Do what you feel is right. Mordecai's a creative guy, and he does what he feels is right. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. The king's so he essentially writes an edict that says, on that day of planned extermination, the Jewish people are authorized, in fact directed, to weaponize and defend self. That's essentially, you all can defend yourself, and you have permission to kill the people that are going to come after you. Okay, chapter 9, verse 1. The king's command and law went into effect on the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar, on the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them. So again, this speaks to Haman not being the only one with this thought. This was like good news for a lot of people in the kingdom. We hate those Jews. I'm so glad the king finally issued this edict. We can get rid of these people. They're filthy and they pollute our system and whatever, all the prejudice thing that's kind of running through their heads. So on the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them, just the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. In each of King Xerxes' provinces, the Jews assembled in their cities to attack those who intended to harm them. Not a single person could withstand them. Terror of them fell on every nationality. So the Jews were prepared. These folks felt like they were going to have, an easy walk through the park, wiping out this Jewish people, and quite the opposite. Jumping to verse 24, and this will be our last verse to read, through 26, the beginning. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. He cast the pure, that is the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when the matter was brought before the king, he commanded by letter that the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews return on his own head, and that he should be hanged with his sons on the gallows. For this reason, these days are called Purim, from the word pure. So this is how the story ends. The Jewish people survive. This festival of Purim exists today for practicing Orthodox Jews. There is an annual festival called Purim, and it's to commemorate this chapter in the history of the Jewish people. So a couple of takeaways I had, and then we're going to wrap this thing up here. So one of the takeaways that I saw in this, looking at Haman, was that prejudice can be a corrupting influence. It certainly consumed him. And we see from what I read, again, I don't know that your translation, well, let me ask. Did your translation, Rhonda, talk about the sons also being impaled? All right, so whether it's impalement or hanging, we see in this instance that this prejudice that consumed Haman caused the downfall of his sons. I personally have the view that prejudice is a learned behavior. And I think Haman learned it somehow. And Haman taught that, whether he did by words or by action. He taught that prejudice to his sons and to his wife, who at that one point said, just hang this Jew because I'm tired of you bellyaching about him. So I think that one of the takeaways is the prejudice that was deep-seated in Haman infected others. And so the casualties that came from that was not his intended casualties, but was both himself and those, in his circle of influence. So the danger of prejudice is ever present, as Haman's story tells us. 2, taking stands for God may not only risk one's safety, but may also risk the safety of others. That's a lesson you don't want to see in here, because you don't want to be put in a position of, maybe doing something that causes harm on another. But I think that's an unavoidable takeaway from Mordecai's story. He stood for God, appeared to be the only one, and as a result, now the Jewish people in their entirety were now threatened. Their lives were pronounced worthless and to be executed. Obviously, God came in and he orchestrated these events to save that from happening. But as we are in positions to take stands for God, I think we need to kind of be aware of the fact that that's going to impose risk on self, and it could impose risk on others. And are we going to be courageous in doing it anyway? Last is that God may place us in positions for a time such as this, like he did Esther, to do something bold and courageous. She did never intend to become a queen, let alone a queen that would somehow save her entire nationality. That was nothing she dreamt about. And yet God made it happen because this one lady was equipped, by God giftedness and equipped with a disposition beyond just her physical beauty to be obedient and to be useful for God, to be put in a situation to do something heroic that's celebrated millennia later among the Jewish people even today. So that's not unique to Esther. That could be something that we find ourselves in a position for such a time as this. Let me close us in prayer. Lord God, thank you for this story. Thank you for this account, important account in the lives of the Jewish people, certainly, and in the lives of the Gentiles and any who would be reading this account, those of us in this room included. I thank you that you're a big God, that you could see things of this nature unfolding and work your will through it. I pray that as we encounter ourselves in challenging situations and situations that require bravery of faith, that we can take stands, that we can be willing to risk the safety of self to honor you and allow you to use that risk and that faith to do big things. Thank you for finding us useful in your kingdom. Thank you for loving us, and thank you for sending us your son Jesus. In his name I pray. Amen. Thank you all.